Just got back from camp, like I said. And on the last day of camp that we had, one of the two staff, Alyssa there, the one in the front, she came out to all of us while we were eating, and she introduced us to something from McDonald's called the McNasty, which I had never heard of. She's apparently been trying to order one at the local McDonald's in Falmouth every day for like a month. They only make one per day. Like once one's been ordered for that day, that's the last, like you can't order one again for that day. And she had tried, she goes in like right as soon as they start serving lunch, says, McNasty, please, but she never got there in time for the other days. But finally she got one, that was it right there. It's burger patties, a chicken patty, a fish fillet, and then all the sauces and toppings of both in all of it. Which by definition is a sandwich, yes. But not really is it a sandwich from like a complimentary flavor standpoint. Not something that maybe I would try it, but that's just me. Today we start a new series about sandwiches, Roman sandwiches, which is not going to be a culinary series, I'm sorry, although several of the pictures that you'll see in the beginning of this sermon will make you hungry, maybe. They did me. But instead, we're not going to be making actual sandwiches. We're not going to be like doing anything with real food. But with the right substance, a figurative sandwich can be just as delicious without all the extra calories. So I'm going to explain to you what a Roman sandwich is. Because, this is just something that I made up. I happened to notice that there were several pairs of things that appeared in the book of Romans, and that some of them together made for really cool pairings to just contrast and compare and to work with together. So I thought, let's just mix them together and do sermons that are based on two of these pairs together at different times, because there are several. So explaining a Roman sandwich, the easy part, who are the Romans? Okay, well, we know who the Romans are. They're the people that Paul wrote the book to. These are Christians that are living in Rome. And a majority of them are Gentiles, though there's enough Jews for him to address them and then to make statements about both sides and the comparisons between the two, which comes into play a lot later through this book. But mostly Gentiles. Now the confusing part, so what makes a sandwich a sandwich? So we know what a sandwich is normally. You have bread, you have meat, you have other things in between the bread. For our context, the bread is the thing that's holding the meat together, which is the book of Romans, and then more specifically the person who wrote it, which is Paul. So Paul is our bread, and he will be the bread for all four sandwiches that we're going to do in the series. The concepts are the meat. The things that make up right in the middle of that, like with any good sandwich, the meat complements itself. If you have more than one thing, it complements itself, because a big mess of any meats may technically be a sandwich. The flavors may not make any sense together. So we're going to try to make sense of these ingredients so that we're not mixing one thing with something entirely crazy. The only sandwich ingredient really that seems to defy complementary logic is peanut butter. Peanut butter goes with really everything. I've not met a thing yet where someone has said, hey, I really like peanut butter and X, and then not found that someone did enjoy that, or then tried it myself and like, okay, that's not the worst thing in the world. Like, my uncle used to eat peanut butter and bologna. My mom introduced me to peanut butter and pickle relish. Love peanut butter and bananas. Love peanut butter and bacon. One of my favorites, though, is peanut butter and marshmallow fluff, also known as a fluffernutter. Got to have one yesterday for breakfast because we had marshmallow fluff left over from camp. So the part that was used from it, they did not use for eating, I don't think. It was for some sort of other stickiness or mess, I don't even know. But they left me some, slapped it on some peanut butter, had me a fluffernutter for breakfast. It was wonderful. For the purposes of our sermon series, though, if you're not hungry yet, get ready. It's even better. The meat of our sandwiches are concepts that Paul pairs together in the book of Romans in such a way that you would not have one without the other. He finds them so delicious as topics that they need to be spoken of together to make total sense. According to Paul, these are the real fluffernutters of Scripture. Right here. We're going to tackle 4 pairs over the course of 4 Sundays. These are concepts that, as we travel through the book of Romans, we'll go sort of chronologically. We'll bounce back and forth a little bit. A few of them are obvious combinations, which, if you're very familiar at all with the book of Romans, concepts of sin and death come up a lot. And we will be talking about a pairing of sin and death. The Roman road is a phrase that they use to describe the book of Romans, actually in a progression of explaining how we are sinners and how that sin has a consequence of death, and that we have an obligation to seek glory through God instead of living this life of sin. So that sin and death is going to be a big one that'll come up. Another one that comes up a whole lot through this, as I've already kind of mentioned, we have Jews and Gentiles, both that are being preached to in the book of Romans. So we're going to do a pairing on Jews and Gentiles as well. Makes for a lovely sandwich. Those two are sort of opposing forces, but they complement each other in a scriptural sandwich form. There's that balance between the clean and the unclean and how Jews and non-Jews could function together in a world that is a new era of life with Jesus. No more cultural segregations, nothing more keeping them from being tied together to each other. So both those pairs, sin and death, Jews and Gentiles, they both tie heavily in to pair with what we are starting off today's series with, which is righteousness and the law. So most of the modern scholars will talk about the law and actually translate it sometimes. Deliberately, they will say, instead of just the law, they will say the Torah, to denote the actual body of laws that are being talked about. Because in the context of the book of Romans, those who were under the law, these Jews, were placed under the jurisdiction of Mosaic law by God himself. And then those who sin apart from the law are the Gentiles, and who they're not being Jews, they have not been made to be subject to the law of Moses. But Paul points out in the beginning of this whole thing that the law makes no difference. And he explains in the book of Romans that they can escape God's judgment only by doing the law. If we're looking at just the law, the only way to escape the judgment would be to do every single bit of that law. And he's going to make it to where both sides, both the Jews in the law and the Gentiles outside of the law, can understand that they cannot ever fulfill this law. But I'm going to stop myself because I'm already starting to pair in two other sandwiches into this one. And I don't want to start mixing the pairs together because that's like having a sandwich with 6 meats, which again, from the standpoint of complementary flavors, is not a sandwich, but rather a novelty stunt. It is a meat mountain of biblical topics, which, by the way, is a real thing at Arby's that you can order. And I know this because Owen has ordered one and took a picture of it to show me. This is not his picture. His was too dark for that. You can't even see it. There's a chicken tender underneath that layer of ham on an Arby's meat mountain. If you want to ask him how it was, just get ready. You got to be prepared to listen to that. So getting back to just establishing righteousness and law by themselves, we're going to touch a little bit on the other things as they come up because there's no way of avoiding talking about sin and death and Jews and Gentiles while talking about righteousness and the law. But I want to focus specifically as much as we can on those two as a pair. So since the law as we know it was for the Jews, Paul's going to have a tough job ahead of him to try to explain primarily to a non-Jew audience what importance there is in a set of rules that they were never taught to follow. They were never raised to follow. It was not part of their life to understand, oh, I'm in the law, or this is a law, for them to have any effect as a Gentile on their life. Paul pairs the two concepts together in chapter 2, mainly is where it begins, and that's what we're going to start it at. And he really, just from the beginning of it, he lays the cards on the table. Romans 2:12 and 13. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. So then he clarifies how the Jews are included because they get included here in this next verse, even if they weren't part of that original Jewish law. Verse 14, indeed, when the Gentiles who did not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. And that phrase, that they are the law for themselves, there's a couple different ways that you can take it, and there's different interpretations and people that can see sort of how he's backing up some Old Testament prophecies about being bound to the laws even if you're outside of it. Others like to equate it to sort of a Stoic philosopher standpoint, which Paul does reference a lot. He'll start quoting Stoic philosophers in certain contexts, and obviously these Romans, they have a knowledge for that. They have a hunger for philosophy. That's something that makes them just interesting as a group of people. So it would make sense for Paul to address them like he's addressing people who like philosophy. And we're going to go with that as kind of our basis for what he's saying by this, that he's alluding to this widespread Greco-Roman tradition of an unwritten law. For the Gentiles, through philosophy, they would read and know that there is a concept of right reason amongst people who are outside of established rules, that there's something built into you that's innate in you that just says, I know that this is right. And that everybody has that regardless of whether they are in the law to have it defined to them or whether they are outside of it altogether. There's that right reason inside. And following the same tradition, Paul claims that non-Christian Gentiles, even though they may never have heard the law of Moses, have in their very natures, created by God, the knowledge of rights and wrongs that the law of Moses ultimately points to. So then they are therefore going to still find themselves in one way or another bound to the laws that Moses demands, such as murder and adultery. They're not going to do those things, even if they were never told, do not commit a murder or commit adultery. They're going to honor their parents and so on. They're going to do these things as universal moral absolutes because they have it in them this right reason. They will do God's will whether they knew that that's what those were at all. So he is just in condemning both sides, the Jews and the Gentiles, in these next couple of verses for them being in or outside of the law. The word he's going to use, that it'll come up in a couple different places here, there's a Greek word it is the word, sunedesis. We're going to see it a couple times coming up here, which it will be in verse 15, is going to be coming up as translated as conscience. So let's take a look real quick at 15 so you can see this verse. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. This is talking about the Gentiles. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, at other times even defending them. That synodesis that's happening here, it literally can be translated as companion knowing. It's a compound word of two things. The S-Y-N is like companion, partner, together with, and then the other side is the knowing part, that it's like a knowledge that you always have with you. It's something that's just paired beside you and goes along beside you to tell you when something, even if it's not written, when something is right or wrong. That synodesis is there as the thermometer that lets you discern where you might have crossed obvious lines. Even the Gentiles are capable of discerning between moral absolutes through the use of their conscience. So if they're able to do that, if that's something that you can be outside the law and understand some moral rights and wrongs from a conscience standpoint, then what is it that the law specifically is doing in this entire context? Well, the law is revealing sin. And like I said, I don't want to make this a sermon about sin, since it's going to come up a lot in its own week, but it needs to be mentioned here because we don't always make the connection that in the eyes of God, broken laws are sin. Like sometimes we focus on only certain acts and certain particular offenses as being sinful or sins, when instead all occasions, if God has spoken out loud law, if God has commanded something to be written down as something to follow, it is a law. And if you are breaking those laws, sin is law breaking. And all people were held to that same bar. Romans 3:20. Therefore no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. We become knowing of the fact that we are doing something wrong, just like Adam and Eve did the moment they took in what they shouldn't have taken in. They become aware of it. When the laws are written down for us to see what they are and know what they are, we know exactly what it is that we are sinning in. Paul argues that the primary function of the law is to make the people aware of that sin, and that the law acts as a mirror for them, that you can see your own shortcomings and your own failures reflected through those transgressions. By defining what is right and wrong, the law helps mankind in general to recognize its inability to live up to God's standards. Everyone needs to recognize that they've broken God's law. Like, we are all lawbreakers. We are all guilty of breaking law. Not for the purpose of guilt-tripping you. I don't want you to think, okay, hey, how dare you be lawbreakers? and make you feel really bad about that. But to understand we are lawbreakers because it is such a high standard set. God placed such a high standard on what he wanted his people to be, what he expected from them. It's something that we can see there's no way. There is absolutely no way. If I'm going to try to maintain the high level standard that God sets in the Old Testament and what he's intended for us to be, in taking care of this earth that he created for us, where we are all to be curators of it and gardeners of it, and making it this immaculate, beautiful thing, we ourselves have to be immaculate, beautiful things. That is a very high standard. Requires a major amount of moral behavior and spiritual devotion, all of which, at one time or another, everyone in this room is guilty of not doing the right way. We are guilty as lawbreakers, and we are incapable of being righteous through the law. And I know that you all know that. I just wanted to make sure that you heard it again so that I can then tell you that there is something even better that comes along that Paul adds to us in this concept next, that there's a way for us to have righteousness apart from the law. It is possible to have righteousness apart from the law, and I know that we all know this, but we're going to read Romans 3:21 and 22. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. So this is something it's been made aware to everyone. It's something that can be known, even from the law. It's been made known. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. So it was there all along, being testified to from the law and the prophets before it ever had a chance to be manifested. It was there waiting to be able to jump in and show us all, guess what? This is the answer. Here it is. You're never going to make it the other way. There is no way you're going to keep the laws. But we knew this from the beginning, and it was never meant for us to feel that we were the worst people in the world. It was for us to understand how high of a standard was being set. Paul introduces that critical concept that everybody in this room knows, that the righteousness from God that is separate from the law, the righteousness is being accessible through Jesus Christ, through faith in him. While the law testifies to this righteousness, it is not the source of it. It is a divine gift available to all who believe, all who choose to accept it. It is there for them to transcend those limitations that the law puts in place. Romans 3:27, 28. Moving right through the book of Romans here. We're just whipping right through it. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. Because of what law? The law that requires works? No. Because of the law that requires faith. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. This totally reinforces the idea that righteousness and justification before God are based on faith. Not on legalistic adherence, not on anything else that we could ever do. It underscores the universal nature of God's grace available to both the Jews and the Gentiles. Faith is possible for anyone of any background. It is not bound by rules. It is not bound by stipulations. It is not bound by qualifications. Faith is the mayo of our sandwich. Paul emphasizes that justification, being declared righteous before God, it comes through faith rather than through observing the law. And this principle is central to Paul's preaching into the Romans. It's going to come up a whole lot, and I hope you're ready for it. By faith in Jesus Christ, individuals are justified and reconciled to God, and that would never be possible from the law alone. Absolutely not. The law serves to make the people aware of their sins. It lets us know that thermometer. It lets us know what we can see in addition to what that synodesis tells us. We have been given more knowing. We've been given a chance to understand even more clearly. And returning once again to that companion knowing, synodesis. It is for those who are outside of any law, outside of any teaching, outside of any belief in Jesus whatsoever, there is still that moral compass. There is still something letting them know that it's not quite right. But we've been given the gift of being able to attach that synodesis to the Holy Spirit, so that we have more of a power of discernment of the ability to know not only is this right or is this wrong, but in the eyes of God and through Jesus Christ, is this right or wrong, and what can we do about it? 1 Peter 3, 21, 22, he's just been talking about Noah and the flood, and so he's talking about water from the flood. And he says, I'm going to close with this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body. It's not a literal thing that he's talking about, that it's washing you clean, but a pledge of a clear conscience. There's that word again, sunadesis. The pledge of a clear sunadesis toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand, with the angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. The law is not ours to worry about. We know it's there, and we have knowledge of it, which keeps us kind of aware, kind of ready for things. But we know full well that's not what saves us. That's not where the cleansing comes from. Our cleansing comes from a much, much more powerful place.